Okay, we're on DAF, bottom of DAF Dalet on Midbeis at the two dots. It's like 5 or 6 lines from the bottom. Haya Gavoa Me Esrim Amma. If, let's say, the Korah that is above your entrance to the Mavul is above 20 Amos, in which case the Mishnah said you have to lower it. So, Ubala Ma'ato, Kama Ma'ato. And you need to lower it. How much do you have to lower it by? So the Gemara says, what kind of question is that? Kama Ma'ait, Kama Ditzarichle. Whatever you need. Right? You know? So, Ella Rechavo Bekama. So rather, the question that we're really asking is, and this involves a little bit of abstract thinking, Rabbi Sai, how wide must the platform that you raise up from the ground? In other words, we're not talking about lowering the bar. The bar will stay stationary. You're going to raise the floor. Okay, so you're going to put a platform. Let's say, just imagine taking a pallet. Okay, you'll put a pallet at the entranceway of the Mavli beneath the Korah. How high, or not how high? We know how high it has to be. It has to be so high to be able to create to limit the gap to less than 20 amos. But the question is, how long must the platform be going into the Mavui? That's the question. So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yosef Omar Tefach, Abaya Omar Arba'a. We have a machlokas. Rabbi Yosef says it only has to be a tefach wide, this little platform. And Abaya says it has to be 4 tefachim wide. So the Gemara says, Lema Baha Kamiflagi. Let us perhaps suggest that the basis of the machlokas is as follows. Deman do Omar Tefach kasavar mutter lihishtamesh tachas hakora, uman do Omar Arba kasavar asur lihishtamesh tachas hakora. So this again requires a little bit of abstract thought. The Gemara's thinking is as follows. What is the reason why a korah, a crossbeam on the top of the entrance to the mavoi, creates the permissibility to carry inside the mavoi? So one possibility is the fact that it creates like an invisible wall from the korah going downwards. Okay? Now, the question is, when I'm allowed to carry inside the mavoi, that invisible wall that's created by the korah, is that from the front of the korah or is it from the back of the korah? Meaning that when I'm walking in, when I'm utilizing the mavoi, can I use the space? Can I carry the space underneath the korah as well, or not? So if the argument is that I'm allowed to use the space underneath the korah, so then the platform should only have to be 1 tefach wide, just like the korah has to be 1 tefach wide, because if the issue is that when I look up I'm going to see the korah above me, so then all I need is that same space, right? And the way that Rashi phrases it is, Dechuda pnimi yori v'sosim. Let me just see where the Rashi is. Kaven deshir esrim amma mishum hekerhu. He says, if the whole issue is that I need to be able to look up and see the korah, harei yesh heker la'omed aloso tefach shenigba tachas hakorah. When I'm standing on that platform, I'll be able to look up. I'm still utilizing the inside of the mavoi, according to this opinion. I'll look up, I'll see the korah, everything will be great. I'll remember that this is an accommodation to allow me to carry inside the mavoi. But if you view the invisible wall that is created by this korah as only allowing you to carry from the inner point of the korah inwards, the mavoi, and the area beneath the korah is not part of the walled-in area of the mavoi, that invisible wall. The invisible wall is within the inner point of the korah and going inwards. So then, the place of heker, the platform which you're going to be standing on, is not directly beneath the korah. The platform that you're going to be standing on is inside the mavoi, so that when you look up at a distance, you're going to be able to see the korah. Because it's not directly underneath the korah, you need to have a makom chashuv, Rashi says. You need to have a place of significance that elevates you beyond the korah, and any makom chashuv, any important place, is at least 4 tefachim. So conceptually, the idea is as follows. If you're allowed to use the space directly underneath the korah, so then the space that you need to stand up on that platform can be also underneath the width of the korah itself, which is 1 tefach. But if you're standing, if the place where you need to recognize the korah is within the area of the Korah and not underneath, so then you need a makom chashuv of 4 tvachim. That's the conceptual difference that the Gemara is suggesting. Answers the Gemara low. No, that's not correct. Dekula yalma kasavri muter lihishtamesh tachas hakora, that everyone holds that you're allowed to utilize the area directly beneath the Korah, but uvaha kamiflugi. But here's the machlokas. Mar savar Korah mishum heker, umar savar Korah mishum mechitza. That the machlokas is as follows. What is the function of having a Korah? Is the Korah creating an invisible wall that allows you, sort of like that cone of silence, right? The invisible wall in front of the Korah that allows you to consider this all a one Rishus HaYachid, and in which case, if it's creating, like Rashi explains, if it's creating that invisible wall, that we look at the outer point of the Korah as creating a wall that goes straight down. Whenever you create a mechitza for a domain, the mechitza only has the validity of a wall if the domain that it is enclosing is at least 4 tfachim in length. Otherwise, it doesn't have a din of a mechitza. And that's why Abaye would say that you need to have a platform that's 4 tfachim deep. But if you hold that it's only because of a heker, it's not creating an invisible wall, but it's only there for visibility, for recognizability, then the significance of the platform is you're not creating a wall here, and therefore you don't need a significant floor space of 4 tfachim for that wall to be valid, because you're not creating a wall. That would be the other way of looking at it, and that's why you only need a platform that's 1 tefach deep. Another answer, the Iba Yisema. Here's another answer. The Kuli Alma Korah Mishum Heker, everyone agrees that you're not creating a mechitza mamish, an invisible wall, but it's really because you want to create something recognizable. V'hacha beheker shalmatu v'heker shalmalo kamiflagi. Demar savar minin heker shalmatu keheker shalmaila, umar savar lo minin heker shalmatu keheker shalmaila. But there's another possible dispute between Abaye and Rava. Everyone agrees that as long as the Korah is 1 tefach wide, that's enough of a distinctive feature to remind you that the Mavui is a separate domain from the Rishus HaRabim, right? And that'll remind you that, hey, once I hit that Korah, I can't carry beyond that point, right? But the question is, why is a 1 tefach wide Korah sufficient? Is it because it's eye-catching, because it's suspended above the air? Well, what about something that's eye-catching that's on the floor? Does that also only have to be 1 tefach wide, or would you say because it's on the floor, you need more of an eye catcher because the eye doesn't naturally wander to the floor in order to be able to grab your attention? And therefore Abaye says, no, it's got to be 4 tfachim deep in order to really catch your attention. That would be another possible explanation.
You need to rest, you don't trip on this thing.
Yeah, let's hope so, right? The Iba Yisema, another explanation is, Dukuli Alma, Amrinan Heker Shalmata Keheker Shalmaila, V'hacha Begezerah Shema Yifros Kamiflagi. Another possible disagreement between Rav Yosef and Abaye, another way of explaining the machlokas is to say that everyone agrees that what's recognizable for the top is recognizable for the bottom. So that's not the issue. The issue is that if we only allow you, if we say that you only have to make a platform that's 1 tefach wide, what about the concern that as people step on and off of this platform, it's going to diminish and erode over the course of time? And so therefore, Abaye is of the opinion, since people are constantly stepping on it and chipping it and knocking into it and so forth, you have to make it 4 tfachim wide to guarantee that it doesn't erode over the course of time to a point where it's no longer kosher. And Rabbi Yosef says, I'm not concerned about it, right? It could be also the same machlokas that we saw before, whether people in the chutzah will be watching out for each other to make sure that it doesn't happen.
What's the length of this?
The length? Well, that's exactly what we're arguing about. Is it 1 tefach length or is it 4 tefachim length? Well, depth. So it depends, I guess, how you define. You're asking the width, you're saying. Probably, presumably, over the span of the doorway. Across the span of the doorway is how high the platform has to be. People would have to step over it, exactly. Or step on it. Either step on it or step over it. Yeah, step up, step down.
It makes more sense with the erosion.
Yeah. Okay. Next. Now we see a different halacha. Up until now we've been discussing the halacha when the Korah is above 20 amos. Now let's talk about the mavoi for midgets. I was told that that's not politically correct, so we have to say a mavoi for the vertically challenged. And if you're creating a mavoi for the vertically challenged, let's say you have a cave and you're going to make that into a mavoi. So you need to drill out, let's say the doorway is less than 10 tfachim high. The minimal definition of a doorway is 10 tfachim high, 4 tfachim wide. So let's say it's less than 10 tfachim high and you need to bore out, you need to cut out additional headroom in order to be able to make a legitimate doorway for the mavoi. So hayapachos me'asar tfachim v'chakak bo lahashlimo la'asar kamachokek. If you need to cut out additional headroom to make it 10 tfachim high, how much more do you have to bore it out? So the Gemara says, kamachokek, what kind of question is that? Kama ditzarich, whatever you need to make it, to supplement it to 10 tfachim. Again, it's a strange question. So ella mashcho bekama. Rather, the question is the depth of the hole. How much does it have to be? In other words, let's say the mavoi goes in down a tunnel, but the tunnel is low. How deep into the mavoi does the headroom have to remain 10 tfachim in order for it to be considered to be a legitimate mavoi? So the Gemara says, Rav Yosef Omar B'Dalet, which really means Ba'ar Ba'a Tfachim. Rav Yosef says it's got to be bored in for 4 tfachim deep to maintain its 10 tfachim height in order for it to be considered a mavoi. And Abaya Omar Ba'ar Ba'amos. And Abaya says, no, it's got to be even further than that. It's got to be 4 amos depth in order for it to be considered halachically a mavoi. So the Gemara now says, Lema b'de Rabbi Ami v'Rebbi Asi kamiflagi. Let us suggest that Abai and Rav Yosef are arguing on the following halacha of Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi. De itmar mavoi shenifratz mitzido klape rosha. Itmar. So the following case is: imagine you walk into a mavoi and immediately on your right or to your left there's a huge breach in the walls of the mavoi. Now remember, I just want to remind us all what exactly a mavoi is. The typical mavoi is where you walk in, you've got, just imagine that my face is the dead end of the mavoi. My face has been called the dead end a few times already. Anyway.
The opening to the courtyard.
No, dead end means dead end. It's a solid brick wall.
Opening's the other side.
Right?
There's side entrances the Rabbi is showing you.
The whole concept of the mavoi is that it's an entrance.
Well, you're not letting me finish. Give me a second. Give me a second. Okay. So my face is a dead end. Okay. So you've got now side entrances, entrance over here and an entrance over here to a chutzner. Each chutzner contains 2 houses. This is the entrance to the mavoi. Okay. So now, so what are we saying? That let's say when you first walk into the mavoi, you turn immediately to your right or to your left, and instead of seeing a brick wall, you see a huge breach in the wall. So the question is that still halachically a mavoi? Because you don't have intact walls on either side when you walk in. So comes along the Gemara and says, so if it's immediately upon walking in, right after you hit the entrance, you hit a breach in one of the walls. So Itmar Mishmei de Rabbi Ami v'Rebbi Asi im yeshom pas dalid matir bepirtza ad eser v'im lav pachos mishlosha matir shlosha eno matir. So Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi say the following halacha: as long as there's wall for 4 tfachim after you walk into the mavoi, where there's solid wall on either side, or if there's a breach, you put up a wooden board or something like that to repair that wall. As long as when you come in 4 tfachim deep, you've got wall on either side, then if you have a breach after that, the definition of a kosher breach is up to 10 amos in a mavoi. But if the breach starts within the first 4 tfachim of when you walk into the mavoi, so then it's now ois mavoi. It's not a mavoi anymore.
What is it then?
It's considered to be not. It doesn't conform to the requirements that the Chachamim had to allow you to put a lechi or a korah in order to allow you to carry. What it's called, we're not going to be able to define yet, but at least we know that it's not a mavoi.
Okay? Where did 10 amos come in? I lost that.
A breach of 10 amos, if it's less than 10 amos, then it's considered to be an acceptable breach, and it's still a mavoi. If it's more than 10 amos, then it's not. Then it disqualifies the mavoi.
We're talking about past the 4 tefachim.
Past the 4 tefachim. If the breach is within the first 4 tefachim when you walk in, so then any small breach, even 3 tefachim, will invalidate the mavoi, and it's no longer called a mavoi. If, however, it's a breach that's less than 3 tfachim, so then we say the principle of lava that we learned about yesterday, that anything that's less than 3 tfachim of a hole is considered to be not a hole.
Does that mean the doorway to the courtyard can't be close to the Torah? Because that's a breach.
No, we're not. We're talking about a breach that's in addition to the entrance to the mavoi. The entrance.
Where does it go to? It just goes to a courtyard.
It goes into a courtyard, right? So exactly. So Gersh, you're right. You're right. If that breach, even if it breaks into a chutzner, but it breaches the mavoi, I think what you're saying is correct. I'm not 100% sure, but I think what you're saying is accurate.
Doors to the chutzner.
You have 2 doors to the chutzner, but the mavoi
has on the same side. If it's within 4, if it breaches another entrance to the chutzner, saying it's not okay.
It would seem to me that it's not okay, but it's not so clear. But we're going to see in a second from the Gemara where the doorways are. Anyway, the Gemara says as follows. So this is that Rav Yosef Islay the Rebbe Ami, Le'abaya Leslay the Rebbe Ami. So the Gemara is suggesting as follows. Rav Yosef holds of Rebbe Ami's halacha, that you see from Rabbi Ami's halacha that as long as you've got solid wall for the first 4 tfachim when you walk into the mavoi, then you don't care what happens afterwards. It's still called a mavoi after that point. So you see that the criterion for a mavoi's depth is 4 tfachim. But Abaya disagrees, and Abaya says that no, the criterion for the depth of a mavoi is 4 amos. Maybe that's the machlokes. So the Gemara says, Amar lecha Abaya, hasan sof mavoi hachatchilas mavoi. Arba amos in ilolo. So Abaya will tell you no. Abaya will say no. I don't disagree with Rabbi Ami's halacha. There we're talking about where there was a kosher mavoi to begin with, and then a breach was created afterwards. In that scenario, I agree that as long as you have 4 tfachim depth before you hit the breach, then it's a kosher mavoi. But what we're talking about now is the creation of a mavoi. To create a kosher mavoi, you need to have 4 amos of depth of wall. That's 10 tfachim high. Anything less than that, you haven't created a mavoi. If you've created a mavoi already, and then a hole damages one of the walls, right? So then I agree that 4 tfachim is all that's needed. So that's the difference. So Amar Abayas, now Abayas says, Mina aminola. How can I prove to you that 4 tfachim when creating a mavoi is insufficient? The Tanya, ein mavoi nitor belechi v'kora ad shiubotim v'chatzeros ksuchim l'socha. So we know there's a famous halacha that we've spoken about already, that Bob was actually citing, which is that a mavoi, by definition, in order for it to be halachically defined as a mavoi, has to have doorways that open up into 2 chatzers, and each chatzer has 2 houses. Right? That's the standard engineering architecture of the mavoi. Okay, so and if you're telling me that the depth of a mavoi only has to be 4 tfachim, then you don't have walls, because the definition of a doorway into a chutzner is 4 tfachim wide. So if the whole depth of the mavoi is only 4 tfachim, then it turns out that each side of each wall that when you walk in is a doorway. It's not a wall, it's a door. It's an opening. So it turns out that you don't have walls.
You have a frame.
You just basically have a frame. Rashi says you may not even have room for a frame. Where are you going to put the frame? Because the frame has to occupy some space. So you're not going to have doors. You're not going to have walls. You got nothing. So how's that called a mavoi? So the Gemara now says, maybe you'll tell me that the 2 doorways that open up to the chutzers is on the back wall where my face was. There's 2 doorways there. But then it turns out that the back wall, the dead end, has to be 2 doorways width, which is 8 tfachim, and a little bit more to accommodate the area for the door frame. Well, if that's the case, v'hamar of Nachman nakitina nezehu mavi shenitzer belechi v'kara kol sha'achar orcho yeser al rachbo ubatim v'chatzeros ksuchim l'socha. But that's impossible, because if you're telling me now that the back wall has the 2 doorways to the 2 chatzers, then it turns out that the width of the mavoi is wider than the depth of the mavoi. And one of the necessary definitions of a mavoi to fulfill the halachic criteria is that a mavoi is longer or deeper than it is wide. And if you're telling me that the only way to fulfill the criterion of a 4 tefach deep mavoi is to have an 8 tefach wide mavoi, then that's not called a mavoi anymore. You know what that's called? It's called a chatzer. And a chatzer has a whole different set of halachic criteria to enable me to carry in a chatzer on Shabbos. So therefore, the whole concept of lechi and korah that we're talking about a mavoi would not even apply to such a structure, to such a courtyard. So the Gemara says, that's my proof, says Abaya, that you can't just suffice with a mavoi that's 4 tefachim deep. It's got to be much, much longer than that. The Rav Yosef's response to that is no. The pasach lei b'keren zavis. And here you really have to rely on a diagram, which is available to you even in the standard Gemaras. If you take a look in the Rashi, you'll notice that Rashi provides a very creative scenario that Rav Yosef says. You can still have a little bit of wall when you first walk into the mavoi, which is then becomes a door frame, if the entrances to the chutzers are on a diagonal on each side, so that when you walk into the mavoi, it could be only 4 tefachim deep, and it's a little bit less than 4 tefachim wide, and yet you'll still have your 2 doors that are 4 tefachim wide each on a diagonal, part of it going into the back wall, which is the dead-end wall, and part of it going into the side walls. So therefore, you'll have, using the diagonal, using the hypotenuse of those 2 corners, you'll have a 4 tefachim wide wall. The door frame will contribute to the depth of the 4 tefachim wide wall, because you can do that. And therefore, it's possible to have a mavoi that's only 4 tefachim deep and less than 4 tefachim wide, and still have 2 door frames that are 4 tefachim wide each in the corners. Now, granted, the walls on the sides will not be solid wall on each side, but the door frame can, as long as it's a legitimate door frame, you view that as part of the wall. And that's the bottom line, says the Gemara. That's Rav Yosef's defense of how you can have a kosher mavoi that's only 4 tefachim deep, even though it has doorways to the chutzner. So now the Gemara says, Amar Abaya, okay, fine. Abaya says, let me give you another proof. Mina minala. How can I prove to you that 4 tefachim is not sufficient? Amar Rami Bar Chama, Amar Rav Huna, lechi habolet midofno shel mavoi pachos me 4 amos nidon mishum lechi ve'eno tzarich lechi acher lahatiro. But Dalet amos nidon mishum mavoi v'tzarich lechi acher lahatiro. So, comes along Abaye and says as follows. Let's go back to our mavoi, okay? My face is the dead end once again. Let's say in my construction of I have to put a lechi on the entranceway to the mavoi. A lechi can just be a stick that I affix to the side of the entrance, on either side. On the inside of the entrance, I take a piece of bamboo and I staple it to the side, to the entrance of the wall, on the inside of the wall, on either side of the mavoi. Let's say, however, I decide to get fancy, and I take a board of wood, and I put it up like this as my lechi. Okay? You got me? Okay? So in that scenario, the Brisa says that if that board of wood is narrower than 4 amos wide, then it's a kosher lechi. If it's longer than 4 amos, wider than 4 amos, so then it itself is not a kosher lechi, but rather a wall extension. And you have to put up another lechi. Okay? So now the Gemara says, I hope the people in Kosher Tube can see me, can see this diagram here. Yeah, that's good. So he says that the Rav Yosef, so the Gemara says, what raya is Abaya bringing from here? He says, if a lechi becomes no longer a lechi with a distance of 4 amos, because then it becomes a wall, so you see that the definition of how much a length of a wall has to be is 4 amos, not 4 tefachim. And so Rav Yosef's response to that is, La'afuke mitoras lechi adiika 4 amos, lemihavi mavi afilu bar tefachim nami havi mavoi. Rav Yosef says, come on, you're comparing apples and oranges. For something to no longer be considered a lechi, then it's a really, really big gezunta lechi. It's got to be 4 amos wide. But for defining something as a mavoi wall, that only has to be 4 tefachim deep. The two are not comparable. And therefore, Rav Yosef says it's apples and oranges, and you can have a wall of a mavoi only 4 tefachim deep, even when the disqualification of a lechi is 4 amos wide. Let's continue. Gufa. Amar Rami Bar Chama Amar Rav Huna Lechi habolet midafno shel mavoi Halchos me arba amos nidon mishum lechi ve'ein tzarach lechi acher lahatiro dalet amos nidon mishum mavoi v'tzarach lechi acher lahatiro. So now the Gemara says, just repeating the Gemara that we said before, is that if I decide to put a board instead of just a stick as my lechi, if the board is 4 amos wide or wider, then you need another lechi in order to make that not just a wall extension, but a recognizable lechi. So now the Gemara says, oso lechi heichan ma'amido. That additional lechi that you're going to affix to that wall extension, how do you do it? So, if you're just adding it to the wall, to this extended wall, you're just making it bigger. So you're not helping things. You're just making things worse because you're just adding to a wall. You're not making an addition. You're not making a lechi. So Amar Rav Papa demuki leidach gisa. So Rav Papa comes up with a very creative solution. He says, we're not saying that you add the additional lechi to that extended wall. We're not saying that you put it over here. We're saying you put it on the other side, over here. You put it over here. That's where you're going to put the additional lechi, and that's why it's recognizable, because it's not at all attached to that extension.
Why is that making it a problem if you put it on the extension?
Because you're not. You're just extending an extension. You're not making a lechi. It's already too long, so you're extending it even further by making it wider. That's the problem. And the Gemara says, Rav Huna Berei de Rav Yoshua Omar, Afilu tema demuki la bahadei dematfi bei o demivtzer bei. Rav Huna Berei de Rav Yehoshua says, no, you don't have to put it on the other side. Even if you add it to that extension, as long as it's a little shorter, or a little taller, or a little wider, or a little narrower, either way, as long as it's recognizable that it's an addition to that board, so then it's a valid lechi. Okay. Okay.
Lechi has to be physically attached, not just leaning against.
It has to be physically attached. Amar Rav Huna Berei de Rav Yehoshua, lo amran ella b'mavoi shmona, aval b'mavoi shiva niter ba'omid meruba al haparutz, v'kal v'chomer michatzer. So Rav Huna Berei de Rav Yehoshua tells us a very interesting point. He says the only time that 4 amma wide lechi is invalid is only when the entrance way to the mavoi is 8 amos wide or more. But if it's less than 8 amos wide, if it's 7, for example, or 6, or 7.5, whatever, so then you don't need to make any remedy to that wall extension, that wide lechi. Why? Because even if it's not a lechi, it still should be considered to be like a sealed wall. Why? Because any time you have a wall which has a breach, but the majority of the wall is solid wall, and only a minority of that wall is breached, so then you view it as a full solid wall. So even if the entrance to this mavoi has no lechi, technically, because this is a wall extension and not a lechi, but view it as like a sealed wall, in which case you're protected from all sides with a wall. And we make this kal v'chomer from a chotzer. Now what the Gemara is basically saying is that, okay, technically, the Chachamim never made that halachic statement about omed meruba al haporetz, that the majority of the wall is solid and the minority of the wall is breached. It's considered to be a full solid wall. That was not stated in the context of a mavoi. That was stated in the context of a chotzer, of a courtyard. But the Gemara says, but if it works for a courtyard, then kal v'chomer, it'll work for a mavoi. Now, what's the kal v'chomer? Uma chotzer she'ena niteres b'lechi v'kora niteres ba'omed meruba al haporutz, mavoi she'niter b'lechi v'kora eno din she'niter ba'omed meruba al haporutz. He says, the Gemara says basically it's a kal v'chomer. The whole remedy of putting a lechi or a kora at the entrance to the mavoi only works for a mavoi, but does not work by a chotzer, does not work for a courtyard. So if the principle of if you have more solid wall than breach on any one side, it's considered like a fully sealed off and enclosed wall. If that works for a chotzer, then surely it should work for a mavoi where the criteria are even less. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute. Ma'ala chotzer shekain pirtzasa be'eser tomar b'mavi shepirtzaso be'arba'a. The Gemara says we're going to see in just a second that there's an opinion, even though we said not that way before. We had previously said that if a mavoi has a breach, the breach can be up to 10 amos. But there's another opinion that we're going to see in tomorrow's DAF, that's the opinion of Rav Huna. And Rav Huna says that if you have a breach of even 4 tfachim in a mavoi, then that invalidates the mavoi. So the Gemara says here automatically you see a leniency by Chatzar that you don't see by mavoi. So just because the principle of Omed Merubal HaParutz works by Chatzar, there's certain leniencies by Chatzar that don't exist for a mavoi. So just because it works for a Chatzar doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to apply to a mavoi. So that's the Gemara's argument. Answers the Gemara, Kesava Rafuna Berei de Rav Yehoshua Mavoi Nami Pirtzaso Be'eser. So the Gemara says no. Rav Yehuna Berei de Rav Yehoshua disagrees with that opinion of Rav Huna that we're going to see tomorrow. And he holds that just like you can have a breach of up to 10 amos in a chutzner and it's still called a halachically a chutzner, so too you could have a breach up to 10 amos in a mavoi for it to still considered to be a mavoi. So it turns out that according to Rav Huna Berei de Rav Yehoshua, there is no leniency in the laws of a chutzner that does not apply to that only applies to chutzner, does not apply to mavoi. And then therefore, if that's the case, the kal v'chomer is a good kal v'chomer. If the principle of Omen Merubal HaParutz, the majority of a wall, as long as it's solid, considers the whole wall to be solid, if that applies to a chutzner, then surely it should apply to a mavoi, and therefore, as long as this extended lechi covers the majority of the span of the entrance to the mavoi, because it's less than 8 amos wide, then you don't need to create any additional lechis. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, L'man Kamrina L'Rav Huna, V'Harav Huna Pirtzaso B'Dalid Svirale. The Gemara says, but wait a minute, let's go back to the original statement. Who is the author of the original statement who said that if the lechi is 4 amos wide, you need to add an additional lechi? That was Rav Huna. And Rav Huna is the one who says that there are certain leniencies by chutzner that don't apply to a mavoi, because he's the one who said that a breach of 4 tfachim in a mavoi invalidates the mavoi, which is not the case by a chutzner. So how can you tell me that Rav Huna Berei de Rav Yeshua, if he's commenting on a halacha authored by Rav Huna, how can you tell me that he disagrees with Rav Huna about that halacha, about how wide a breach is going to be in a chutzner, in a mavoi? So the Gemara answers, Rav Huna Berei de Rav Yeshua, Taima de Nafshei Ka'amar. Answers the Gemara that Rav Huna Berei de Rav Yeshua, Taka does not hold like Rav Huna. He holds that a breach in a mavoi can be up to 10 amos just like a chutzner. He's commenting on a statement authored by Rav Huna. He's saying Rav Huna's halacha makes sense even though I don't hold of all of his halachas by mavoi. And the reason why it makes sense is because I hold that you can make a kal v'chomer from a chutzner. And therefore, the only time that Rav Huna's halacha that I happen to agree with would apply is only if the entrance to the mavoi is wider than 8 amos. But if it's less than 8 amos, I personally hold that you can make a kal v'chomer to a chutzner, and if by a chutzner we say Omen Merubal HaParutz is considered a sealed wall, so too by a mavoi, Omen Merubal HaParutz is considered to be a completely sealed wall. Rav Ashi Omar, Afilu Tema b'mavoi shmona nami lo tzarech lechi. So Rav Ashi is a little bit punctilious in this point. Up until now, the Gemara has suggested, says Rav Huna Berei de Rav Yeshua, the only time that you don't have to add a lechi is if the entranceway to the mavoi is less than 8 amos wide. Because why? Because if you have a lechi that's 4 amos wide, and the entrance is less than 8 amos wide, so then you have majority of wall and a minority of breach, in which case you don't have to do anything. It's considered to be a sealed wall. Rav Ashi says we can take it one step further, and we can say that even if the entrance is exactly 8 amos wide, we also don't need to add any remedy to that lechi. Meaning that if you have exactly 4 amos of lechi and 4 amos of breach, even though you haven't satisfied the Omed Merubal HaParutz criterion, because it's now exactly equal, 4 amos of closed space, 4 amos of open space, you still don't have to do anything. And let me tell you why. He says, because monavshach, I Omed Nafish Nitar Ba'omed Merubal HaParutz. He says, because if the lechi is just slightly larger than 4 amos wide, so then you've got a majority of wall and a minority of breach. The iparetz nafush nidon mishum lechi. And if the board that you put up for the lechi is slightly less than 4 amos wide, so that you don't have a problem, because the only time that a lechi is not a lechi is if it's 4 amos wide. If this is slightly less than 4 amos, granted that you have more breach than you have board, but the board is a lechi, and therefore you don't need to do anything else. So my amar, so the only other possibility is deshavu to Ravayo ki hadadi, that they're exactly Exactly, you mamash were mitzamtzem. You actually got it exactly right. Exactly 4 amos board. Exactly 4 amos airspace. He says, come on. He says, Havalei safek divrehen besafek divrein lahakel. There's no way to actually measure exactly what it is. And so you have to, even with the most accurate measuring tools, you're going to have to say it's a safek at best. Which is wider, the board or the airspace? And because it's a suffix, whether you've got it exactly right or whether the board is slightly bigger or the airspace is slightly bigger, you've got at best a suffix whether it's going to work or not. And so if it's only a suffix derabanan, we can be certainly lenient over here. The most that you can argue is that there's a suffix that maybe it's exactly the same width. Exactly 4 amos of board, exactly 4 amos of airspace. That possibility is extremely remote, but even if you're going to be fearing for it, it's only a suffix derabanan, and suffix derabanan is lakula.
But if you put in the alechi, it wouldn't hurt.
Of course not.
We don't have to.
When it comes to these kinds of gemaras, right, we can always say, well, you can always fix it, right? What we're trying to do is to minimize. The Gemara says that the sign of a Talmud Chacham is someone who doesn't have to resort to a chumrah. There's a famous Gemara in Brachos, which the machlokes is, do you say hamotzi lechem in haaretz or motzi lechem in haaretz? So the Gemara says everyone agrees that if you say motzi lechem in haaretz, that it's okay. The question is, can you say hamotzi? So the Gemara says, well, then just say motzi, don't say hamotzi. The Gemara says, no, a Talmud Chacham has to show that he's a Talmud Chacham by showing that even though there's something questionable about this, but I can do it, because I know the halacha.